We all know the autocratic rule instilled in the Russian Empire. That is without a doubt. From the early days of the Tsardom of Muscovy to the eve of the February Revolution in 1917, countless Russian monarchs imposed their rule with full force, such as Ivan the Terrible with the ruthless Oprichnina and with the role he played in his own son's death, along with Catherine II's illegitimate ascension to the throne and suppression of the Pugachev rebellion, and finally in the era of emergency rule and counter-reform initiated by Alexander III. However, with all of these examples of illiberalism and autocracy, there's one czar who gets a reputation for being rather innovative and forward-thinking for his time.
Guess that dank emperor, you uneducated swine.
I'm not talking about this guy, but rather this guy, Alexander II, otherwise known as the Tsar Liberator. And although some may dispute this title on the account of his rather conservative and ambivalent attitudes to the Great Reforms, I'd beg to differ. The story starts with Alexander's uncle, Alexander I, who initiated the reform process of Russia's peasantry. However, this included a lot of caveats favoring the nobility and was only really implemented in the Baltic region. Even worse, peasants within the Baltic weren't even compensated with land. You see, even at the beginning of the 19th century, the Russian Empire still had a feudal society in which peasants worked the land owned by the nobility. This was called serfdom. This created a worry in the aristocracy that there would be an eventual societal backlash against serfdom, thus encouraging the unwritten proviso that peasants should own land in order to avoid being a landless proletariat. Papa Alex was not having any of it, and handed responsibility to his brother, Nicholas I, who stated that serfdom was an evil, palpable, and obvious to all. Yet he was worried about alienating the nobility, given that they supported him and his brother in the Napoleonic campaigns, the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, the Polish Uprising of 1830, and the Hungarian Uprisings of 1848. He also thought the Decembrist revolt was pretty much the fault of the reforms of his brother, but he could not afford to give too much to the peasantry, so he did what his brother did. He passed responsibility to his son, the rather distrustful Alexander II. Alexander already had experience with the reform process, having already chaired the Peasant Reform Committee and Railroad Construction Committee. Yet he saw what many others saw, a rotting state that was humiliated by war with distant powers. And to him, one of the most archaic institutions most responsible for this rot was serfdom. He was so worried about peasant backlash to serfdom that he stated regarding emancipation that so great a work should begin from above that it might not proceed from below. Thus, on the 19th of February, 1861, he did what his predecessors could not. He issued a statute that emancipated the serfs. But hold on, there's a catch here. Although he effectively removed the nobility's police powers in the countryside and gifted peasants arable land, he couldn't alienate the nobility either. Thus, Alexander's ministers created a system of redemption payments that the peasantry had to pay to their old masters, for a period of 49 years. And even worse, the nobility used the majority of this revenue to repay old debts and mortgages on previous property and serfs. The result was a skyrocket in noble bankruptcies and a reduction of noble arable lands. Peasants now had the right to marry, acquire property, and conduct trade. However, as individual redemption payments were hard to track, the government invoked the clause of collective responsibility in the Obshchina, otherwise known as the peasant commune. Peasant communes were basically villages that performed societal functions like redistributing land amongst their inhabitants. Collective responsibility meant that redemption payments would not be collected at an individual level, but at a communal one. So apart from this, some may argue that the artificial market valuations for redemption payments, the poll tax, corporal punishment, and internal passports removed the true benefits of emancipation for peasants. However, that is not necessarily the case. Redemption payments were in fact at least partially financed by the government. Apart from the liberation of some 20 million serfs, Alexander's government introduced the Zemstvo in 1864, which were elected assemblies at both the district and provincial levels. Although highly segregated and favoring the nobility with their three-class voting system, the Zemstvos did encourage autonomy and self-taxation. However, they were not implemented in Poland, the Baltic, and the Caucasus. This was mirrored by municipal reform in 1870, which effectively created independent city governments and curbed nobles' privileges, who until then did not pay taxes. Like the Zemstvos, they suffered segregation as there were strict property qualifications in order to participate in the councils. Judicial reforms were also introduced where the judiciary gained complete independence from the administration, judges were appointed for life tenures, a bar association was created, and the accused were entitled to lawyers even at a pro bono basis. Apart from this, courts were to be segregated, with criminal courts trying everyone except peasants who were tried in volost courts. To further the claim that Alexander II deserves the title of liberator, he attempted to expel a member of the Russian Supreme Court in 1867, only to reluctantly obey his own law. This is also paired with the assassination attempt of the Governor-General of St. Petersburg, General Trepov, in which the accused was acquitted by a largely sympathetic jury. The reforms on education and religion are probably the most widely penetrating, given that schools became slightly more secular and were opened up to serfs. Educational reform was also closely linked with military reform, given that the length of military service correlated with education. Universities also gained more autonomy and even allowed women to attend courses. Church reform, however, was largely a failure, given that the clergy's sons would leave the profession and the Tsar reorganized parishes into bigger units. What spelled was disaster because there weren't enough parishes for clergy's sons, therefore forcing them to join the army. Restrictions were even reimposed to dissuade them from going to university. However, to me, the most egalitarian of Alexander's great reforms was the Universal Military Training Act of 1874, which obliged all social classes to serve in the military. No longer were the nobility exempt from conscription, and peasants were allowed the incentive to pursue primary education in order to lessen service time. Literary classes were also introduced, as soldiers were required to read and write, and the cadet corps was abolished. Military schools were also created for non-nobles, and discriminatory conscription policy targeted at Jewish youth were revoked. Given the last point, nationalities' experiences of the Great Reforms varied widely, with travel restrictions on the Jewish Pale of Settlement being east, along with renewed Baltic German and Finnish autonomy. Similar concessions were given to the Poles, along with generous terms of serf emancipation, which explains why the Polish peasantry was largely inactive during the Polish Rebellion of 1863, one largely propelled by the gentry. The result was the confiscation of Catholic church lands from 1864 to 1865, the abolition of Polish government councils in 1867, and the dissolution of the Congress of Poland, which in turn was reorganized into 10 Russian provinces in 1868. Although there was no inherent Russification of Poland, Warsaw University became a Russian institution, and the Russian judicial system was introduced in 1876, and everyone just kind of had a bad time. Okay. Alexander's administration also did plenty of other bad things too. They suppressed and ultimately deported the Circassians and other North Caucasian ethnic groups in the aftermath of the Caucasian War, incorporated various territories in Central Asia like Khiva, Bukhara, and Kokand, and proceeded with the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. But I mean, he also freed tons of political prisoners and relaxed censorship in academia, books, and newspapers, even if there were still fines and suspensions. I mean, it's apparent enough that the term glasnost, not that glasnost, this glasnost, originates from this time. Even socialist novels like Nikolai Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done passed through censors. Ironic. However, the good times could only last for so long, as a man by the name of Dmitry Karakazov attempted to assassinate the Tsar in 1866. This changed the mentality of Alexander into one of even deeper distrust for reform, causing his administration to institute a philosophy called the dictatorship of the heart. Censorship was gradually reinstated, and the atmosphere just got really intense, with tribunals against terrorists being imposed on 1878. On the 26th of August, 1879, through an executive committee meeting, the terrorist group Narodnaya Volya even condemned Alexander to death. Things were not looking good. Alexander felt hopeless in the matter, but placed his trust in General M.T. Loris-Melikov, who was able to launch several consultative commissions to systematically review the Great Reforms on February 1880. Although historian Gregory Fries stated that this was wrongly described as a parliamentary reform, I would disagree. The reforms recommended by Melikov laid out several plans to reinvigorate the taxation functions of the Zemstvo and city governments. But most importantly, they laid out plans to allow Zemstvos and other autonomous units the ability to form preliminary committees to examine draft laws. This could have been seen as a birth of representation in the legislation branch of the Russian government instead of that pesky State Duma created in the aftermath of the 1905 revolution. But alas, it was not meant to be. On the same day that Alexander signed the plans into law, he was finally assassinated by agents of Narodnaya Volya. Chaos ensued, and his son Alexander III was crowned Tsar. And almost immediately, feuds occurred within his cabinet, resulting in Loris-Melikov's resignation and the introduction of emergency rule. Emergency rule pretty much worked like martial law, where the government could override judicial rulings, zemstvos, municipal governments, pretty much everyone. Lucky enough, this lasted up until 1917, so Russia was in effect under martial law for more than 30 years. Scary stuff. In addition, he gave governors more veto powers, introduced the anti-Semitic May laws of 1882, and created land commandants in 1889, which effectively reintroduced police powers for nobles in the countryside. No more freedom for serfs. I'm quite sorry to all my Polish, North Caucasian, Central Asian, and Turkish subscribers, but in all honesty, Alexander kind of deserves the title of liberator. Of course, one could argue that his reforms were compromises and may reflect his greater desire to keep the Russian Empire from disintegrating. But it seems that he had some insecurities and simply wanted to be respected by his subjects. Never mind his obviously illiberal conquests, I cannot object to that. But I mean, apart from that, he even reduced visa fees and eased restrictions to travel abroad. What autocratic incentive could he exactly gain from allowing subjects to import different ideas from abroad, whether they be moderate or radical in substance? As Alfred Reiber succinctly put it, on matters about which he had made his mind, he usually found a loyal subordinate, an instrument of his will to carry it out. Where he felt himself uncertain, he tossed the issue like a juicy bone into the pack of his squabbling ministers, and waited to be convinced by the strongest or most clever of them. But even with the ability of persuasion, Alexander still had his own convictions, and those most closely aligned with the importance of private property and individual freedom. He was the autocrat at the end of the day, and he chose to obey many of his statutes, lending a renewed credibility to Russian institutions. And I personally think that merits some praise.